Welcome to the OneLife Maps podcast. Here's your host and co-author of Listen to My Life, Maps for Recognizing and Responding to God in My Story, Sharon Swing.
Greetings, this is Sharon Swing, and I am so excited to have this conversation today. Our guest among us is Lori Shoults, and she's a dear friend. She is the producer of Sibyl's book club that we do through OneLife Maps. So she hangs out with Sibyl and they read a new book every month and have a good conversation with it around those books with a community of people that are just interested in those books at the intersection of life story and spiritual practice. Joan Kelley is around the table with me today.
Hi, everybody.
And Lori, I'm just so excited to talk to you a little bit about your story today. And thanks for coming.
It's nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. Now, Lori has been on quite a journey, as she says, and she has really taken to the Ignation Exercises. And so some of you may not even be familiar with the Ignation Exercises. So we're going to ask Lori a little bit about her story and the Ignation Exercises and where that has taken her in her spiritual journey. So she's been a part of OneLife Maps for how many years now?
I think it's been about maybe 8 years.
Going on 8, I think, right?
Like that, yeah.
It has been a while.
Yeah.
And so I am interested to get a little bit more of the backstory about your spiritual heritage. Tell us a little bit about where you grew up and what was your perspective of God and where did that come from?
Well, my heritage is actually a really good word for it because my grandparents and my parents were both pastors in the Salvation Army. And so I come from kind of a long line of, and actually on both my mom and my dad's side from the Salvation Army has been my church tradition. So a lot of people don't even know that that's a church, but it is. And so that's what I grew up in. And I also, I would say there's never been a time in my life where I haven't been connected to church and connected to a knowledge and a relationship with God. But I would say in my, having grown up in it, I feel like I kind of inherited my belief system and my religion, I guess I would call it. And it was a really good foundation, a really good starting point. If you know anything about the Salvation Army, it's a very scripture-based, Protestant denomination. And one of the big things about the Salvation Army that a lot of people probably do know is the service aspect of it. And so I would say growing up, that was just a really natural part of my upbringing was that outward expression of your faith, So doing, serving, and having a sort of a social justice, kind of mindset in the midst of all of your faith walk was really beautiful. So I spent a lot of time, in the church just growing up and growing in my own faith, but then also pretty early on started even serving in the church and then even outside of the church as just a part of my in my spiritual experience. But I would say when I got into my 40s, and at that point I was I got married young, had 3 kids. I was a teacher for a short time and then stayed at home with my kids, when we were young married. And I would say I was home with my kids for about 18 years. And somewhere in the midst of that, we were doing all kinds of, it felt like all the right things. Serving in the church, we led youth group for a long time. And I didn't necessarily feel like I was a spiritual giant by any means, but I led Bible studies and I was doing a lot of my own learning and experiencing God. But I would say, looking back on it, for about 40 years, I knew a lot about God, but I didn't really necessarily have a lot of emotional experience of God, if that makes sense. And I didn't realize that. Some of it just had to do with having probably been in a similar, when you're surrounded by the same thing for a long time, you don't even really know what you don't know, what you're missing out on. And so I encountered at one point in time in my about 10 years ago now, somebody that I was working with a family that I was coming alongside, and she happened to be a counselor and a spiritual director. And when we were meeting together at one point, she asked me just a question that I couldn't answer very well, and it was pretty simple. It was just kind of curious. It seems like you're pretty okay all the time, she said. Kind of curious where that strength comes from and where that leaves you with the Lord. And I found myself wanting to say, well, my strength comes from the Lord. But there was something inside of me that knew that if I said that, it might be true to some extent, but there was something inside of me that knew that I couldn't answer that question very honestly. And so I found myself wrestling for a couple of weeks with that. And the next time we met, I started to share with her what my response, the best response I could come up with. And in the end, ended up finding myself, she said after about 5 minutes in, "How are you feeling right now while you're sharing this with me?" And I ended up saying, well, do I look like I'm feeling something? Because I didn't
tell me.
I wasn't crying.
Tell me what I'm feeling.
Yeah. And so I was just kind of, taken aback. And again, I wasn't used to being poked around at. I feel like I had been pretty well behaved, in my. I didn't get challenged, I guess, when I think about it. So just the fact that she was asking these questions was kind of shaking things up on the inside.
Well, it sounds like it may not be a challenge for just anybody to say, "How are you feeling?"
Right.
But for you at that point in time,
yeah,
that was wait a minute, feelings?
Right. And I had no idea how disconnected I really was from my emotion at that point in my life. So this was long before I knew anything about the Enneagram or, what my personality type was. And no one had ever questioned the fact that I had it. It seemed like I had it together pretty much most of the time. So this didn't seem like a problem to me. So anyway, in the midst of trying to answer that, she said, "How are you feeling?" And I ended up, when I didn't, notice, I couldn't tell what I was feeling. I ended up just continuing to share, she said, yes, she could see that I was feeling something. And so as I continued to talk, the tears just started flowing, and I had no idea. I was so disconnected from my feelings at that point that you may as well have said, there are these two holes on my face and there's water pouring out of them. It wasn't matching. I can't even remember what I shared at that point, but I spent about 3 hours at that point then sharing, parts of my story. And so I just, it began a journey for me, I would say at that point, of some spiritual awakening. And so I would say that was a summer of deconstruction. I kind of had to fall apart before, God started putting some of the pieces back together. But he led me on this very organic journey, a combination of, having some time in spiritual direction, which I didn't even know what that was at the time. And I found myself reading. So I went, one book led to another, and some spiritual practices like solitude. And in the midst of all of that, God was just really teaching me a lot of things about myself and more about himself. And so I would say, if I could kind of jump forward and say, now looking back on it, it was a time of just unlearning. It's like that middle of life. You've spent the first half building everything up, and this was like, taking it apart again, but for a deeper intimacy and experience of God. So
I know some people, as they make a spiritual transition like that, it starts with an emotion, leads to a spiritual transformation of some type, but it's almost like we have to put down, like you described, what we have done, right, and almost ask a question like, wait a minute, is this a best kept secret that there's that there's
right.
more?
Right.
Is that what it felt like?
Yeah.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Why hadn't anybody told me?
Right. And exactly. I felt like I must have said 100 times, how did I never know this? I mean, I felt like I didn't even know who I was for a little while.
So how did I never know this? What's this?
Yeah.
How would you put words to that?
I think what I was missing. I mean, I just up to that point, I feel like you know how Brene Brown says you can't numb emotions selectively. I feel like because I wasn't experiencing a depth of, I wasn't allowing myself. I think I had a lot of defenses, a lot of ways that I was keeping myself from actually feeling, to not experience the darker parts of life, and to be able to maintain sort of an illusion, I would say, of contentment, which I almost even spiritualized. Find a way to be content in all circumstances, which really just meant don't let that touch you, And I had, unbeknownst to me, I had ways of, survival mechanisms that had kept me, that served me well in that part of my life. And as Sibyl would say, that doesn't serve you. It's not going to serve you now in this stage. So I didn't know.
So there was this peeling off of layers I'm hearing here too, right?
Yes. And it was looking back, I feel like God was gentle, and he really went before me. And as far as, it was difficult to find a place that could hold that at the time. Kevin, my husband, was really, if you know the Enneagram at all, he's a 4 on the Enneagram. I'm a 7. So he was wonderful about, sort of receiving all of this new emotion, at least for a period of time. And even for him, it got to be a little bit more disconcerting after a while. But he was at least a safe place to explore all of that. In my church world, I would say it was hard to find, it was almost like I was speaking a new language. And it wasn't that people weren't open to it, but I feel like at some point we got to a place where it felt like we needed to have, a different kind of place to maybe grow in. We left our church not because there was anything negative or bad about it, but I felt like God was just saying, attach yourself to me in a new way, and let go of what you've always known and been attached to for this, in this season. So we found ourselves moving over to Willow Creek, which is where I stepped in, and there he went before me as well. A friend of mine from Barrington, when I talked to her a little bit about what I was experiencing in spiritual formation, she said, well, if you're looking for spiritual formation, you should try this Thursday class, which at the time she had just finished teaching, and Joan and Gail, Joan, who's here today, was just beginning to teach. And so Willow didn't necessarily have spiritual formation oozing out of the weekend services. That wasn't necessarily, being a larger, seeker-friendly church. That's not necessarily what I was finding there, but I did find it in the sort of in the underbelly.
So in the basement, actually.
Yes. Truly. Yeah.
But so you were reading books. You were finding your way into these books that were spiritual formation related. So for people that may not be aware of spiritual formation kinds of resources, how would you describe what you were encountering in those books that were not a part of your spiritual tradition?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, I would say prior to that time, I wasn't a big reader in general. Here, I was an educator, elementary educator, but I wasn't, I didn't do a lot of, I wasn't very reflective. I guess that's probably a good description. And so when I started, kind of searching for some language around what I was experiencing, I found myself, one of the first books that I read was Sacred Rhythms by Ruth Haley Barton. And I just, all of a sudden, I felt like I was, she was naming what I was experiencing. And so it was really an inward journey. It was, what I was, a deeper place of reflection and paying attention to, my emotions and things that were happening internally that I just had not even paid attention to before.
So it sounds like this inner spiritual life had been tapped into, starting with a question.
Yeah.
and you were off to the races.
Yep. And it never stopped. So those books really became my teachers in places that I didn't even know what questions to ask. And one book would lead to another, and I found myself going from Ruth Haley Barton to Henry Nouwen, and I mean not long. I mean, within about 6 months, I found myself reading C.S. Lewis and eventually Teresa of Avila. So I went straight. I landed straight into the even to the mystics, and started connecting with spiritual practices and even the historical church, which I feel like coming from this an evangelical kind of tradition, I think we became somewhat untethered from that. So I experienced things like, more of a sacramental, experience. Like I had never taken communion before. Had never been baptized. It wasn't a part of my tradition. We had our own ways of acknowledging and recognizing those things. But for me, the first time I took communion, I felt like it was a physical experience for me. And so, reading these books just gave me a little bit of a window into traditions and spiritual experiences that I just had never even considered.
Well, and into these emotions that you weren't aware of. Like, Lori, we've had many conversations about how you discovered like pain and joy can live together in the same space.
Right. I mean, that was, so in every step of the way, I felt like God was bringing a combination of people. You were a big part of my story at that point, Joan, when I'm in the process of trying to even imagine how to hold pain and joy together. I mean, those were so separate for me. I could, if I had pain, I couldn't even picture those, sort of intermingled. And I feel like he gave me people again and experiences that just helped me capture a vision for it. So it was a holistic journey, I would say, of like head, heart, and gut.
Yeah, I've heard that here. And even just this last little section, you said communion, it became this body experience.
Yeah, it was physical. Yeah.
The recognizing and responding to God in the midst of your story was, it sounds like, just bringing you alive with experiences of God.
Right.
Oh my goodness. So there's so much history in between here, but you found the Ignation practices in the midst of all this. But first we have to describe what that is.
Yeah. So the Ignation Exercises, it comes from St. Ignatius, so it's from the Jesuit tradition. And if there's one tradition, one Christian tradition that I have not really been connected to, it's the Catholic tradition. But when some of the practices that I was engaging with had even come from the Ignation Exercises. One was the Examine. And so there were some things that I was, like touching that I had no idea really what, the broader spirituality that it came out of. So I started encountering, various teachers like Father Michael Spiro when we got connected to the practice, and just starting to recognize what the Jesuit spirituality was, this Ignatian spirituality. And when I first encountered the Ignatian Exercises officially, I was in the process of helping develop a spiritual formation certificate program. And we were kind of looking for a framework that we could, use to, I feel like in the process of all of this journey, I thought this doesn't feel unique to me, as far as being a believer for 40 years and kind of in some ways feeling like I was having this awakening. And I thought there's got to be a path, like how as a teacher, I felt like what's the path for spiritual growth? There's something that I've just experienced, and it felt like God was giving me a bit of a blueprint of the different things that had occurred in my, this year-long journey that I had been on. And in the process of that, I landed in this book, The Ignatian Adventure, when we were, thinking about the foundation for this content. And I, all of a sudden, when I first encountered the Ignatian Exercises, and I realized the sort of the scope and sequence of it, I felt like I had been there before, so I connected so deeply to it, because basically the flow of the exercises, they call it, St. Ignatius calls it weeks, but it's not actually like weeks like a week. It's more like movements. So he has an introductory, part that starts with God's love for you. And then it moves into recognizing that when you encounter God, that you tend to encounter yourself. And so this is exactly what happened at the beginning of my journey, is that I had an encounter with God that led to really a deconstruction and a deeper knowledge of my own self, and in particular, really my own sin, that I had never even... not that I thought that I was perfect by any means, but the stuff that I would have called sin, or what I would have thought of as sin, was stuff that I was probably pretty good at not doing. And I was really discovering in the midst of that early part of my, I would say spiritual awakening or second conversion, I was encountering my pride and my ability to sort of do things on my own. And so in the Ignation Exercises, it starts with God's love for you, and really that just keeps coming back around and coming back around. But as you move from that part in the introduction to really your own sin patterns and those kinds of things, then it ends in that introduction with the God's love and forgiveness and mercy.
Right. And because we really can't face our own sin without the covering of God's love. Mm-hmm. We can't bear to be
right.
To be honest with ourselves about ourselves, right, without knowing that we're loved.
Right. So what I discovered in that is that to the extent that you this is my interpretation of it, to the extent that you can actually receive or know that you are loved, feels to me parallel with the amount that you can actually face into yourself. So I feel like that, really goes hand in hand. So now I look at that journey, and I think the Ignation Exercises really promotes this, that you're always learning more about God and more about yourself. And those things are going hand in hand throughout your entire life and spiritual journey. And so to the extent that you recognize how deeply you are loved, you can afford to then come out into the light and see yourself more truly. So it feels like come out of hiding. Right. So that's the first, beginning of the Ignation Exercises. That's the introduction. Then as you move into the first week, it's basically recognizing... I want to give you a little bit of a very specific...
Lori is opening the book called...
The Ignation Adventure.
And give the author so they can...
this particular book happens to be my favorite resource. Just coming from an evangelical background, I felt like this was a really friendly introduction to the Ignation Exercises. It's by Kevin O'Brien, and it's called The Ignation Adventure. So the beginning of it, he names it The Adventure Begins, and those are the movements that I just shared with you. The first week he calls Experiencing the Boundless Mercy of God. So this is the part when you actually recognize God's mercy. And so after encountering yourself and your own sin, then you recognize God's merciful love. And you get into his forgiveness. And then in the second week, it's really the story, the life of Christ. So he calls that Accompanying Jesus Christ on Mission. And so you go through really the gospel stories. And for me, this was really powerful because I feel like this is the journey that God led me on, is I knew all of these stories before. But after I had encountered myself in this way, I found myself engaging with these stories in a much more experiential way. In particular, for me, the story of Peter. So it's a place that God led me early on, in that sort of encounter with myself. And all of a sudden, that story became a huge part of my journey and my awakening, and also just a more tangible, emotional experience of God, and why I needed his grace and forgiveness. Mm-hmm. And then after the second week, after you go through that process of the life of Christ, then the third week is being with Jesus in his suffering and death. And so it's the journey to the cross. And then the fourth week is experiencing the joy of the resurrection. And so basically, in light of all of this, how am I to live my life now? So it's joining Jesus Christ on mission. So those are the movements of the spiritual exercises.
So how would you say the spiritual exercises have changed you?
I think for me, it gives a framework for the experience that God gave me very organically. And what I love about the concept of this Ignation spirituality is it's not something that you just encounter once. I think it's a pathway for growth and, really for the entire spiritual journey. So in the Jesuit tradition, they keep coming back to this over and over in their lifetime. And kind of like, I guess, when you think about how Scripture is alive and active, that every time you come back to it, you've changed and you know something different about yourself and you know something different about God. But you continue to come back and encounter those movements as a part of your ongoing spiritual growth. So I love the opportunity that it provides, to just keep on learning and growing. So
really how your story to just, can begin to run parallel to Christ, and it gives you that structure to be able to see that. Right. Your story right up next to his. Yeah.
And it just, I think there's something about recognizing, I quite often have talked about the spiral, the spiral nature of the spiritual journey that I feel like I just feel so connected to right now. And it's not so much that, the spiral nature being that's almost like Henry Nouwen says, it's like a downward mobility. So when you think about how in our culture we think about, going up and up and up and getting better and better, and actually the spiral journey, a big part of what I've discovered is that it's not that we're getting worse, we're just becoming more real. So I think that the spiral kind of goes around and around, and you're ever learning, ever deepening in understanding God's love for you. And as you progress along the spiritual journey, if you looked at Henry Nouwen's book, he talks about downward, spirituality basically. And at the end, I think it's learning to share in Jesus' suffering. I think at the beginning of the journey, you kind of, at least I'll speak for myself, you kind of feel like there should be no suffering. And as you continue to progress along that path and you keep coming back around to how Jesus did it, you realize, oh, no, this is a part of the journey. And actually, I'm not sure you can get there without the suffering.
Interesting. So what are you doing now with the spiritual exercises?
So I've been working for the last couple of years on a project that I'm basically hoping to bring. It's called the Ignation Journey. It's in development right now, and it's a contemporary approach to the spiritual exercises. So basically, it's taking the Ignation adventure and the content of the Ignation exercises, which is out there in many different forms. But it's almost like putting it together with spiritual formation, if that makes sense. So I really, I feel like Ignation Exercises is often thought of as a school of prayer or a school of discernment. And I think there are a lot of, after going on this journey of spiritual formation with all these different resources and, things that I feel like God led me to along the way, I've really wanted to bring those things together so that it's a little bit more experiential, a little bit more holistic in the approach, and also addresses the possibility of different learning styles and pathways. So the hope is that somebody could experience the Ignation exercises and have a visually beautiful experience, as well as an invitation into some different introductions into some different resources.
Well, and what you have done, literally, it is gorgeous. It is so beautiful. And I can't wait to see how that gets out into the world eventually. But you've also got this library of incredible resources that it would take people years and years to find. And you've kind of cherry picked these beautiful articles or chapters or readings or videos and all, and put them into this sequence that allows us to go on this beautiful journey and kind of introduce us to all these different authors that we might choose to go deeper with.
Right.
Someone that particularly resonates with us, and experience them in a very different kind of contemporary way that when these exercises started wasn't available because there wasn't as much published
Right.
in these different books, and when you think of YouTube and
Right. There's a lot
just
available out there. Yeah.
this is a particular time in history when these kinds of resources can be accumulated, and you've curated them. I mean, it's artistic and beautiful, and so I think the word you are a curator is just such a description of what you have packaged so far. So I can't wait to see how that goes.
But you've also created kind of this container with all those resources, but with spaces in between to reflect. And that's been a huge part of your own journey. And so
Right.
that's the part that I love as well. It's a beautiful container of things that I could just engage my head with if I wanted to. But you have left spaces for me to engage all of myself.
Yeah, and one thing that I would say too is that it's tempting when you go on the inward journey to do a lot of this on your own. And one of the things that feels like is so important about this kind of a journey is to not do it alone. So the hope is that you would be able to engage this journey with at least another spiritual friend. Ideally, the Ignation Exercises is intended to be done in the context of spiritual direction. And so when somebody does, this particular, when it was first developed, the thought was to actually leave your life for 30 days and go out and do a 30-day retreat. And, not everybody can do that. So they've, over the years, developed things like the 19th annotation, where it's really a retreat in real life. So it's basically more like a 32-week journey that people go on. But even in that, when you do this officially in the Jesuit tradition, you do it in the context of meeting with a spiritual director weekly even, to process and pay attention to. And then the spiritual director helps discern when you're even ready to move from week to week.
Joan,
So-
say a little bit about what is a spiritual director and what do they do?
A spiritual director is someone who kind of a co-journeyer on our spiritual walk that is able to listen and hold space where we just talked about a container. I always like to think about you're kind of holding a container of space for that other person to have this ongoing conversation with God. So it's not so much that this person is the director, God is the director, but you are help pointing them back to Christ and helping them name and notice, where he's at in your walk. So spiritual direction isn't so much about, like a counseling appointment where you might be trying to get somewhere, or a coaching appointment. It's really just about holding that space for the other person. So what a beautiful partner to have in this journey as you walk through the Ignation practices together.
Yeah. That's probably one of my biggest visions for a program like this would be to be used in the context of spiritual direction. So as a tool for spiritual directors, to walk with someone through the themes of the exercises and to help discern. And really, when I think about spiritual direction, I feel like it's really asking really good questions. So paying attention to God's movement, with and for that person, and asking questions, kind of like the question that sort of sparked the beginning of my own spiritual journey recently.
Well, you have been on quite the beautiful journey. So thanks so much for joining us today, Lori. Is there anywhere that people can get a hold of you, or any invitation that you have for people?
Yeah. Well, the program that I'm working on is not quite done yet, and that'll come out at some point. And I'd love to share the website. It'll be an online opportunity as well as have a hard copy option at some point in time. I would say right now, if you were looking to get a hold of me, I would say my email is that what you want, the email?
Anything you want.
Okay.
If you really want to hear from people.
Sure, I'm happy to. It's Lori Shoults, so LORISHOULTS at att.net.
Well, there you go. So, Joan, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, great to be with you.
And listeners of One Life Maps podcast, thank you for joining us again today. I am so grateful for you. If you'd like to support us in doing this podcast and all we do with Listen to My Life, we'd love for you to know about Patreon. You can make a donation of $5 or more per month, and you get these beautiful thank you gifts of audio meditations that will help you along the path. And someday I'm thinking to myself, we ought to put together a collection of audio meditations to go along with the Ignation Exercises.
That's great.
So that would be an interesting project to take on. So many blessings, everyone. Have a great week.
Have you thought, I don't know myself anymore? Have you wondered, is there something more? Are you at a crossroads in life and asking, which way will lead me toward expressing more of who I am made to be? Are you looking for a way to understand the restlessness you feel inside? Are you seeking a deeper spiritual life and desire to rediscover who you are through God's eyes? You're ready for the life mapping experience of Listen to My Life. Go to onelifemaps.com to purchase your portfolio of visual life maps. While you're there, check out our upcoming virtual coaching groups, live workshops, and options for you to facilitate the Listen to My Life experience with others. That's onelifemaps.com. OneLifeMaps.com.